I'm bringing this meeting to order, and why my phone rings just as that happens, I don't really know, but it did. So I'm just hanging up on somebody. So we have with us for the first hour Wilfred Greaves, Assistant Professor at University of Victoria, and Peter Kirkick, Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Governance at St. Francis Xavier. And I think Professor Greaves gets the prize for the most colorful background. So with that, we need 5 minutes each, gentlemen, and so we'll get started with that. So, Professor Greaves.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and I thank you for hosting this important discussion on issues related to climate change, security, and the non-combat role of the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm privileged to be speaking with you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on southern Vancouver Island, where I'm fortunate to live and work. Climate change is the greatest medium and long-term threat to security in Canada. While this is not a novel assessment, it is a point of increasingly urgent consensus among security scholars and other experts. The climate security nexus, as it is often called, has been expressed in numerous reports and assessments and is reflected in the growth of new institutions and programs focused specifically on this topic, including the new NATO Centre for Excellence on Climate and Security currently under development. In a 2021 journal article, I outlined 5 climate-related threats to and in Canada: human security threats, economic threats, Arctic threats, humanitarian crises, and increased domestic conflict. My findings and those of colleagues and peers find that no region of the country is immune to climate-related insecurity. Indeed, the very diversity of climate-related disruption produced by Canada's vast geography and diverse communities is a fundamental aspect of our current and future climate challenges. One result of climate-related environmental changes is the Canadian Armed Forces have been required to increase their domestic operational tempo, providing emergency response to extreme weather events. Canada's armed forces are good at mounting large logistical operations on short notice, making them an indispensable tool for government to respond to environmental disasters. Operation Lentus, the standing framework whereby civilian authorities can request CAF assistance in responding to natural disasters, was activated at least 37 times between 2010 and 2021, and with increasing frequency. For instance, in 2021 alone, had 7 different Lentus deployments in 4 provinces and 2 territories, compared to 1 in 2020 and 3 in 2019. Last year, hundreds of military personnel deployed under Op Lentus to help prepare for flooding in Yukon, wildfire evacuations in Northwest Ontario, wildfires in Manitoba, and to provide potable water for the people of Iqaluit. Meanwhile, hundreds more CAF members supported the federal government's response to COVID-19 through Operations Laser and Vector. While some Lentus deployments are relatively small or their tasks straightforward, others have been in response to the most destructive environmental disasters in Canadian history, such as the 2013 floods in southern Alberta, which displaced over 100,000 people, the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, which displaced nearly 90,000 people, and last year's combination of wildfires and flooding in my own province of British Columbia, which displaced more than 50,000 people and resulted in the west coast of Canada, including the Port of Vancouver, being temporarily cut off from the rest of the country. Notably, each of these disasters was the most expensive in Canadian history until it was exceeded by the next. Whereas the 2013 Alberta floods caused approximately $5 billion in damage, the Fort McMurray wildfire caused nearly $10 billion in total damages, a figure that is likely exceeded by the cost and economic losses related to the floods in BC. In fact, British Columbia in 2021 provides an exemplar of the indispensable role the CAF plays in protecting the human security of Canadians. The wildfires and flooding disasters led to the deployment of hundreds of Canadian Armed Forces personnel to assist with emergency response and relief efforts. In the midst of a heat dome which fueled wildfires and killed nearly 600 British Columbians over 2 weeks between late June and early July of last year, the CAF deployed more than 300 personnel to support local and provincial wildfire response, including fire suppression, construction, and airlift. In November, the CAF contributed to the whole of government effort to address the floods, with more than 500 personnel delivering food and supplies, conducting reconnaissance and damage assessments, constructing flood defenses, and helping to evacuate people, pets, and livestock, including the dramatic helicopter rescue of nearly 300 people trapped by landslides on Highway 7 near Agassiz. This exemplifies the capabilities which the CAF can bring to the table that other actors cannot, and which will be increasingly required as the climate crisis worsens. In light of these events, I can only conclude that while the CAF's ability to deploy domestically in response to environmental disasters is vital, it is also insufficient. I conclude my comments this morning with 4 brief points why current disaster response capabilities in Canada should be increased in the years to come. The first is that climate impacts and extreme weather are increasing the need for operational deployments and thus risk the straining of CAF resources, which will not only be needed across the country, but also for longer periods of the year as a result of less predictable fire, flood, and other extreme weather seasons. Number 2, the climate change impacts affecting Canada also affect our neighbors, partners, and allies, which means that established practices of resource sharing and cooperation will be strained due to the concurrent demand for finite resources. For example, such as current programs for sharing firefighters with foreign jurisdictions such as Mexico and California. Notably, the increased demands upon and therefore reduced availability of civilian emergency resources from other jurisdictions will likely add further demand for the CAF to be the respondent agency domestically. Number 3, the greatest danger is not just the increasing frequency and severity of climate-related extreme weather events, but the increased likelihood that they will occur simultaneously and strain the capacities of government to respond. British Columbia last year experienced 3 major disasters spaced out over less than 6 months. But what if in that time there had been another extreme weather event facing another major urban area in Canada on a scale comparable to the 2013 Calgary floods or the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire? A blizzard in Halifax, a snowstorm in Toronto, the concurrence of these climate disasters in future will substantially reduce the efficacy of the Canadian Armed Forces' ability to respond. Finally, I conclude by simply noting that the overall health of the CAF is vital, therefore, to its ability to effectively respond in these situations. And so broader discussions around the health of the armed forces in terms of the respect and standing of all of CAF members, diversity and inclusion within the ranks, the role of women, and the need for strong and forward-looking leadership are also relevant to the CAF's efficacy to respond in these kinds of situations. With there, I will hold my comments, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Greaves. Professor Kickert.
Good afternoon to the chair and committee members. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining you from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I am honored to be here and thank you for the opportunity. Climate change, the natural hazards it amplifies, limited provincial and territorial investments in disaster management resources, and the Canadian Armed Forces' unique capabilities have led to the CAF's transformation from a force of last resort in disaster response to a force of first or only resort. But as this committee has already heard, this tempo of domestic operations will negatively affect the CAF's operational readiness and training for its primary combat role. Further, the CAF provides only response and relief. It does not do mitigation, preparation, and recovery work. In short, the military is not a cure-all to the current disaster management gaps in this country, particularly its lack of a disaster workforce. Now, possible military-centric solutions are to establish a special CAF branch or operational command focused exclusively on disaster response, or to ensure a fully dual-use military, equally trained and prepared to deal with traditional security threats and disasters. I would argue, however, that this will turn the CAF into a jack of all trades and a master of none. The CAF has a central role that no other government body can perform, deterring and defeating potential enemies, which requires a very specialized skill set. Other civilian groups and agencies can assume most of the disaster response roles performed by the CAF, and for far cheaper, but not vice versa. The RCAF cormorants that rescued the 300 people that Dr. Greaves referenced during the landslides in BC last November offer a great example of the kind of contribution the CAF should be making to disaster response, as do the dozens of times Canadian Ranger patrols have been used to assist communities during floods, fires, and severe weather. Additional investments in existing capabilities and responsibilities, such as increasing the CAF's primary search and rescue assets or offering the Canadian Rangers more training and experience in disaster response, would allow the CAF to assist in disaster events across the country without affecting the primary function of the regular force. Now, during your meeting last week, Josh Bowen made a convincing case for the development of localized and interoperable volunteer teams with standardized training and competencies, building off the array of NGOs that provide response, relief, and recovery support in this country. As this committee has already heard, Possible models exist, particularly Germany's Federal Agency for Technical Relief or Australia's State Emergency Services. Both organizations have small cadres of full-time professionals that assist with administering and training thousands of volunteers at the local level. Importantly, however, both organizations have recently raised concerns about volunteer recruitment and retention. Australia offers a cautionary note on the volunteer system, particularly for Canada given the similarities in our approaches to emergency management. Recent research there has suggested that the traditional model of volunteering is in decline, with high turnover rates, older volunteers, and growing levels of burnout. Now, much like the CAF, the Australian Defence Force has been shouldering more of the burden. Earlier this year, 6,000 military personnel deployed to assist in flood relief activities. As a result, Australia is also discussing how to move forward, whether the military should embrace a larger response and recovery role, if the country needs to adopt a new approach to volunteering, including incentivization, or if it requires a professional civilian emergency response force, key issues that Canada must also consider. Local responders help tremendously during the first minutes, hours, and days of a disaster, but are eventually overwhelmed or are required to deal with their own personal and property concerns. While rapid disaster response aid NGOs help fill this group, they need help. And it's time for Canada to consider investing in a professional and permanent disaster management workforce, perhaps a Canadian Resilience Agency or Canadian Resilience Corps, an organization of paid full-time and part-time responders that can be quickly mobilized and deployed to disaster zones for response and recovery efforts. To justify its permanent existence, such an organization must also be engaged in every phase of disaster management, not just response and recovery, but mitigation and preparation, including the training of local response teams. These efforts would pay for themselves. Every dollar spent on mitigation and prevention saves between $6 and $13 in response and recovery. Again, possible models exist. A permanent disaster workforce could, for instance, adopt FEMA's tiered system with a force of full-time personnel, a cadre of on-call response employees, and a group of reservists. However it is structured, the establishment of a Canadian Resilience Agency or Corps would provide the kind of disaster workforce that this country is currently lacking and alleviate the pressure on the Canadian Armed Forces. I look forward to discussing this further during the question period. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor Kicker. Madame Carrie Lynn Finley, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for being here and for your thoughts on this. The questions you're posing are exactly the questions we're wrestling with at this committee. We know that there is a need for some domestic deployment. So what should it look like? Should it be within CAF? Should it be a separate agency? Should it be a specially trained agency, either within or without? And so you're asking the same questions we certainly have on our minds. I'm interested, and either one of you can respond to this, what sort of training regime do you think would be required to build specific Canadian Forces units to combat climate change? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Professor Kicker.
So in terms of, preparing the CAF for a greater response role, I mean, they already do a really good job of this, and that's one of the reasons why they've been used so extensively. The CAF's regional liaison officers that, work so closely with local emergency managers and provincial emergency management teams, they do a really good job of creating that ease of transition for the CAF into a disaster response role. So I think, in terms of moving forward, if the CAF is going to continue with this role, those kinds of relationships need to be expanded and maintained, sustained over the long period of time. So I think, keep on doing what's worked so well. That's one thing. Now, if the CAF is going to, fulfill this disaster response role moving forward, and we're not envisioning a civilian agency to do it, the CAF does need greater training in standard kind of emergency response procedures. We can see a situation where perhaps they receive some training in, for instance, wildfire fighting or flood mitigation measures. There's lots of specialties, right, that can be brought into a training regimen to better prepare responders for these kinds of emergency situations. And as I kind of said, I'm not sure that is...
Yeah, I think this has been one of the issues that yes, they've done a good job. We all appreciate the efforts they've made, but they're not at the moment really specifically trained for firefighting, say, or flood mitigation, that sort of thing. And of course, there's a lot to be said for on the other side of it, the mitigation preparation side of, better diking and investment in things that will help lessen the effects. What would be the educational requirement to be a member of this vocation within the Canadian Forces? Would it be the same as it is now, or do you think there would have to be a different educational requirement? Either one of you?
I'll just add something related to that. I don't know that the initial educational requirement for recruitment into the forces would necessarily be different if this was more mainstreamed as part of the mandate for the forces. I think the technical skills would obviously need to be improved upon, but that presumably would be training that occurred within the CAF rather than prior to it. I do think that there's another suite of skills, though, that are relevant here and that should be considered, which is that there's a whole host of what we might call social and emotional skills that are required for people responding in these kinds of emergency and disaster situations, not least of which is the need to be interacting with people in those communities who are under great duress and in situations of crisis. And so I think we should also attend to the ways in which the appropriate training for CAF personnel performing these kinds of roles also extends to training them to be able to effectively interact with community members and to engage with people in a range of different kinds of physical and social communities across this country, all manner of diversity, in a supportive, constructive, and respectful way. And so I think there would be a basket of training and skills related not directly to the firefighting skills per se, but to the associated context in which these kinds of operations are occurring.
Professor Greaves, you said that you felt CAF was indispensable to this, but would you also be in favor of a separately organized group that is specifically trained to do this work outside of CAF, or do you think it needs to be within the forces?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. As currently configured in this country, the CAF's role is indispensable because, as my colleague Dr. Kickert said, there is no other agency able to kind of swoop in and provide these kinds of support. So the CAF is currently absolutely indispensable. But I certainly have been quite persuaded by arguments which Professor Kickert and others have made about the need to really establish perhaps a more robust and distinct body of some sort to provide these kinds of roles. It's not obvious to me that this is a core military function, right? The CAF is the tool available, and so it's the tool which the government of Canada deploys. But certainly understanding the difference between warfighting, which is the core, the core function of the armed forces, and the kinds of civilian emergency management support that we're discussing here is highly relevant. And I think that there might well be very strong arguments for considering the need for an alternative agency of some kind to better perform this function so that the CAF can better perform its other core functions.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Ms. Finley. Mr. Fisher, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Our last study was recruitment and retention, and it's really kind of fascinating how that touches so closely to what we're talking about today. Essentially, the Canadian Armed Forces being pulled in multiple directions, as Professor Kickert said, going from the first force of last resort to the force of first or only resort. And of course, Dr. Greaves used the phrase, which I like, the increased tempo for domestic events. So we've had a number of witnesses over the last week or so speak to varying recommendations for a path forward. And there were some distinct themes, and you touched on some of them today. One, that there needs to be greater investment in civilian emergency response capacity, and that the military, to the extent that they are called on to respond in a domestic capacity, that additional resourcing and specialized capacity, regardless of whether it's the regular force or the reserve force, is needed. I'm interested in both of your thoughts on the appropriate division of responsibility between military and civilian. And because time flies by, I'm also going to throw out that when it comes to civilian capacity, how much of this can we expect to be built up at the provincial level? Last meeting, we heard about the fact that this is essentially provincial jurisdiction, but the provinces have the ability to reach out to the federal government when they need help. and the federal government rarely denies that help. So I know I threw a lot at you there, but first I would ask Professor Greaves to speak to that, and if the other Professor Kickard would like to speak to that as well, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, sir. A couple of, I think, big and important issues to address there. In terms of your point about federal versus provincial jurisdiction, I think that's a highly salient concern, but I would personally raise some warnings about allowing a kind of patchwork quilt of response capacities across the country being determined by the different distinct, fiscal and climate-related needs of each of the different provinces. As we know, as members of this committee know, there's a lot of resource sharing that occurs in Canada. CAF personnel located in one province will be deployed to support an Operation Lentus deployment in another province. And so I think we see an almost inherent kind of interprovincial quality to what we're discussing here. And in that context, while some particularly at-risk provinces might well be served by improving their own emergency preparedness and disaster response capabilities. I personally would suggest that it's an important role for the federal government to have its own capabilities that it can contribute, either as an initial or as a supplementary, response to other capacities that might exist at the provincial level. If I may just quickly offer a thought related to your question, but in a climate context, when we think about resilience, the most resilient forms of response are going to be the ones that are the closest to the community, the closest to the local level. And so to the extent that personnel and resources are having to travel long distances to respond, there will be room for disruption and delay, and ultimately the effectiveness may be somewhat undermined. And so I think that models which cite resources and human capacity and personnel within communities or as distributed as possible is probably one that's going to prove to be the most resilient in a climate changed future. And so in terms of the various approaches that have been identified, I would defer to my colleague in terms of the merits of many of those. But from what I've seen and heard from other experts, the models along the lines, for example, of the Canadian Rangers, which are inherently community-based, which are deeply rooted in particular communities and regions of this country, is a model that to me seems very commendable and offers a lot of potential value in a somewhat broad and climate environmental disaster context.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and it drives at, I think, a lot of what I was trying to highlight in my kind of opening there is the need for something else, that the CAF cannot be the only response tool that we have as a country, and that we need to do a better job of building up our local capabilities, our humanitarian disaster workforce. And Dr. Greaves is right. Resilience starts from the bottom up. So you build these local emergency teams. They know the region. They know who is vulnerable. They can respond quickly, and that's great. We absolutely need that. But at some point, right, that local response does exhaust itself. And so we need something else. And right now, it's hard to replicate the hundreds of boots on the ground that the CAF can put on in very quick order. But I would argue that, given the CAF's other responsibilities, that something else should come probably from the federal level, and it should be able to deploy into the provinces and territories as required. And so whether it's a new civilian agency or some other kind of disaster workforce that we can envision, I think that's going to be required, as Dr. Greaves pointed out. I mean, there's only more disasters and kind of emergencies and severe weather coming down the pipes. So moving on this quickly is important. And I will say that national responses are important. So the local is absolutely vital, but I think as the Australian conversations, and they seem to be a couple of years ahead of us after their bushfires in 2019, 2020, they had a large-scale national commission, right, on national natural disasters. And one of the things they highlighted was we do need a national response. Australia does have state emergency services that are far more robust than what we have at our provincial territorial level, but they are overwhelmed. And so something more than it was required, a national response is required. And that's the conversation they're having right now. And I think that's one that this panel is having as well. So this is very timely discussion, I think.
Normandine, 6 minutes, please.
Mr. Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Professor Kickers, Professor Greaves, thank you so much for your presentations. Reading your work, we see that there is something very similar between the two of you. You have published a lot about the sovereignty of the Arctic, both of you. And I would ask the same question to you both, but with a long preamble. We have used the CAF to respond because they're always ready, they're always trained for many disasters. But one of the issues we have is that the members of the service have another regular job when they have to be as far as the reservists are concerned. And they have to be let go from their job to be able to go to serve for the emergency. Now, if it were possible to look at the work that has to be done to allow us to occupy the territory in the Arctic, wouldn't that not allow us to better preserve our sovereignty? Isn't there something that could be done by using the rangers? It would be a win-win situation if we had a department that would deal with that, strengthening the rangers in the north.
Okay,
Thank you so much for the question and for bringing in the Canadian Rangers. They are very active in emergency response, and historically they've been very active in emergency response. They've responded to forest fires and floods and avalanches. And not always just in their communities, but also in adjacent communities. So, and I do agree with your comments that any way we can strengthen the emergency response capabilities of the Canadian Rangers will benefit their communities and adjacent communities a great deal. Now, that said, if you're going to be emphasizing this role for the Rangers, the ability of Ranger headquarters staff to actually support that also has to be facilitated. So I think increasing the number of administrative personnel that Canadian Ranger patrol groups have access to that can help facilitate these operations is going to be vital if the Rangers are given a broader kind of disaster workforce role moving forward in the north. Again, we're focused on the Arctic. I work a lot with community responders in Nunavut, and one of the ideas they have for emergency management that's, will hopefully alleviate some of the need to bring in outside help are Inuit public safety officers. And these are officers that, if the program was developed, could be focused on marine safety, emergency preparedness, search and rescue, fire prevention. And there's models for this that exist in Alaska, for instance. And again, having that local capability, I think, would go a long way to protecting communities in the north who are so distant and so far removed from external assistance coming from the south. So as much as we can build up that robust local capacity, it's important everywhere. It's even more important in the Arctic, given their remoteness and isolation, the time it takes for the south to get there.
My colleague, Professor Kickert, is the expert on the Rangers, so I will certainly defer to him in terms of the overall assessment of the Rangers. But what I would simply add is that most Canadians will associate the Rangers with the Arctic. They almost go hand in hand, and they are a vital component of Arctic communities and Canada's Arctic sovereignty. But I would simply note that the Rangers exist in many communities outside of the north as well, in the northern parts of the provinces, from coast to coast to coast. And in fact, a majority of the Rangers are not located in northern Canada, understood as the territorial north. And so just in that sense, I think the Rangers are in some sense an underutilized resource, not in terms of the immensely important work they do on the ground, but in terms of the understanding and appreciation that we have of them as a non-Arctic specific asset or resource, that the Rangers already exist in communities somewhat more southernly located in Canada, and that they provide equally valuable, services and supports to those communities that we might well build upon as we move further and further south, and as we think about Canadians living at more and more southerly latitudes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I draw a parallel with the United States because you spoke about Alaska. That they use their National Guard for domestic deployment, so they rely less on the reservists, say, than we do. I wonder if we should call a bit more on our reservists and better fund them. That might create
I'd like to hear what you have to say about retention and recruitment for them. It might be more attractive.
I would say in terms of the reserve, the mechanisms to bring them out, to solicit, reservist volunteers to come serve during disasters in the rapid tempo in which, the CAF has to deploy for disaster response, is that something that's does it work that well? I think there's serious questions around that. Again, to draw a parallel, this is a conversation Australia is also asking about how to use its reserve. And in 2019, for the first time, it actually called out the reserve, meaning that they had to respond, which is something they're allowed to do, because it's built into their defense act or defense legislation. But I think there are questions around whether or not that our reserve is structured to do that, how effectively it can do that, whether they have the training for that. And again, if recruitment and retention is a concern, maybe building an organization outside of the Canadian Armed Forces might draw upon a much more perhaps diverse and perhaps a part of the population that does not want to join or serve in the CAF. So I think there's lots of possibilities around the increased recruitment that potentially a civilian agency or number of agencies could have that the military can't.
Madame Normandine, Ms. Masson, 6 minutes, please. You're on mute, Lindsay. Still on mute.
She's got a button on the headset.
It's on your headset.
I have the new headset.
Okay, your time's up.
Oh.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now, Mr. Chair?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, what's going on? Anyway, new technology is always my dilemma. So as we're hearing, we've heard many recommendations in terms of that volunteer sector, getting people to volunteer their time, as Madame Normandin was talking about, bringing in the reservists. One of my concerns, of course, is with the armed forces, they have that incredible training. They have that years of building all of these skills and those training opportunities. So when you pull into maybe those NGOs, obviously volunteers will not have the same kind of training. So could you expand on some of the, and maybe I haven't read the Australia report. I'm so grateful that you come with this expertise to bring that to this committee. Were there key things that they highlighted in terms of things to watch out for to protect that sort of idea, that labor force, as we would be drawing upon it if we were to go down that route?
No, that's a great question. And I would say there are training models out there for local response groups. In fact, they exist in Canada. Some of our local volunteer responders are incredibly well trained, and I would say far better trained than the regular CAF soldier for a lot of disaster work, and so when they come on scene, they know how to do things. And if we were to build a larger local system, we'd have to ensure there was sustained training in things like light search and rescue and flood mitigation and fire mitigation and fire smarting communities. There's a lot of different things they could do, but I take your point about the general nature of volunteering, and I think that's the bigger conversation that is required. Both Germany and Australia have very robust volunteer systems, but both have been put under stress recently, and there's been questions raised about whether or not they can continue to retain volunteers. And so this is where Australia, for instance, now is getting into conversations about incentivization. It's getting into conversations about how to ensure the government pays back employers for lost wages, so that workers who are responding don't lose their salaries, which is something that Mr. Bowen highlighted during his time before you and is extremely important. Germany, for instance, has that built into their system. If you go respond to a disaster, you are going to be covered. Your employer is going to be compensated. You'll get your wages and salary. But beyond that, there's conversations about incentives, tax breaks. In Australia, they're having a conversation about whether or not you're part of these teams. You don't have to pay a licensing fee, for instance. There's different mechanisms in place to try to bolster people, but I think those are big questions, right, that we have to talk about. Is this all volunteer system going to be sustainable in the long term? What can we do to make sure these volunteer groups feel most supported and most inclined to participate? Those are serious questions. And I would also just say, the German model is thrown around a lot, and it's a great model. But I'd highlight, we hear the number 80,000 a lot. Important to remember that 80,000, 16,000 of those are youth, are children, part of their youth wing, and then only about half of the 80,000 are active responders. And so again, they do incredible work. They're also a bit of a social club in that people have a lot of social interaction through their participation in this volunteer disaster workforce. But still, there are questions around whether or not this is going to meet the needs long term. And happy to talk about either of those systems more if the committee is interested, the Australian or the German model.
Mr. Greaves, do you have anything to add, or?
Yes, thank you for the question. All I would add is to kind of draw attention to what seems to be, I'll use the term, if you'll forgive me, dual use nature of some of the tasks and training that such a climate corps, the resilience corps, would actually be equipped to perform. To Professor Kickert's point, the existing kind of volunteer groups that do some of this search and rescue or emergency response kind of work are extremely well trained and extremely highly qualified individuals. And they're also individuals who, admittedly, there's going to be variation in different ways, but they're people who spend a lot of time in outdoors, in nature, have excellent outdoor skills and kind of, wilderness and orienteering type skills. And that when we take a step back and think about the application of those potential skills, there's actually a range of tasks that such a group, if they were being properly remunerated and properly supported, might also be able to fulfill. So we have these very acute kind of emergency situations, which is the focus of our discussion, and I think appropriately so. But there are also other kinds of circumstances. For example, at the moment, we're dealing with this debris washing up on the western shore of Vancouver Island from this marine disaster. And it's a volunteer-led initiative to be pulling all this plastic garbage off of the beaches of western Vancouver Island. That's another role that this kind of a corps would, I think, be quite well suited to. It wouldn't be the most urgent of their responsibilities, but it would seem to be in a universe of relevant skills that people who are being properly compensated might be quite eager to spend their times doing because of the direct benefits to their own communities, their own regions, and to the environment as well.
Of course, as we talk about being so reactive ultimately to climate disasters, the natural disasters that we're seeing in terms of what the CAF has to respond to or is being asked to respond to. Can you outline, if you know, some of the key things or ideas of what the CAF needs to do to prevent further issues? So what the CAF is doing environmentally, what they need to do environmentally in order to proactively not create more of the issues. I know for one example, in terms of having to deal with the North and the fact that they can't maintain their bases because the permafrost is melting, and what they're doing in reaction to that, but also what they have to proactively do to try and start to avoid some of these things.
That is an important question, but unfortunately Ms. Maston has run out of her time, and this time your time really is up. Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes, please. Colleagues, I just point out that we had 20 minutes before our next guests arrive, 25 minutes worth of questions. That's probably not going to quite work, but I think I'll run a full roll of questions in the anticipation that our friends might be a bit late. So, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we are getting a lot of the ingredients to what the solution is. We have a wealth of Canadian Armed Forces personnel who are trained, but who can no longer be deployed, but would like to be involved in the Canadian Armed Forces. And we have others who are fully trained, but no longer want to deploy. So we've got their command and control features. They know how to follow or lead. And we have also had the comment made that $1 spent in prevention saves $6 to $13 in repairs. So I'm wondering if what we're starting to outline in terms of a solution and a possible new body for response to disasters would be a hybrid of the Army Corps of Engineers, because they do engineering for prevention, as well as are called in when disaster strikes, but also the aspects of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is under Homeland Security in the States and would be under Public Safety in Canada. So we're looking at a hybrid of both of those. So the Canadian Forces, as was mentioned, who have specific skills that are needed for situations that are actually national defense and military related, could do their work while using the skills they've learned at a later point in time when they no longer are deployable. Is that something that you think would be potentially on guard and able to respond when necessary? So a hybrid of the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA, if we're looking at a parallel.
I would just say to that question, I think the military is going to, moving forward, have a role in disaster response. And I'm not advocating that it has no role. I think that, we have to use the specialized skill set that CAF has more, so for instance, the search and rescue capacity it has, if we bolster that and improve that, that benefits Canadians, who go missing in the wilderness, but can also be used during disaster situations. And I think that's something that the Canadian Armed Forces search and rescue structure is a great thing to build and kind of strengthen for that. But again, I would argue that putting too much of the emphasis on the Army engineers, for instance, it's a pretty small body of personnel. I just don't think it's going to cut it right moving forward. And I think that, again, the CAF is very reluctant to do anything besides the response element because it's already taking up so much of their time. So again, no mitigation, no prevention, no preparedness, no recovery, which are the most time consuming, the most expensive, the most important part of the disaster management spectrum. So I think, this idea that, there could be, dual use and civilian agency with the military, I do agree with that. I just don't think we can allow too much, right, of the CAF's regular forces to be drawn into this if there is a civilian agency that is created or to kind of handle it as well. And just one thing else, you speak a lot about, structuring and how this could be structured and what this could look like at the federal level, for instance. I think, again, highlight Australia, some of the things they've done since their national commission in 2020 was they've always had Emergency Management Australia, which was focused on response, but they realized that wasn't enough. So they've also now established a National Recovery and Resilience Agency whose focus is on helping communities recover from disasters and then building them in a more resilient way moving forward. And they've also established an Australian Climate Service to assist with severe weather events. So again, we see a growth of structures to enable this response because they are so complex, because they draw upon so many different resources. Again, I think that's a conversation we could also have in Canada, again, based on the similarities in our structures with Australia.
Okay, and there was the aspect that our local governing bodies, they're key. The feds aren't called in until it's a last resort. And as far as the engineers, it's not the type of engineers we have currently in the military. They're people who blow up things. I would be looking at more civil engineer type. But locally, when we had our floods in Renfrew County back in 2019, well in advance of the actual flood occurring, people are looking at the freshet from north, the melt, the water levels, everything that's going on, and they were well prepared. So it wasn't until it struck and it overwhelmed every other level that we called in the military. So I'm still convinced that the key start has to be at every local level, since they know the community and have a pulse on the situation. So how do we weave all that together and call in the national aspect when they are indeed the only source that's left?
Again, an important question, but well over time. Madame Lambropoulos.
Thank you,
5
Mr.
minutes,
Chair.
please.
Thank you. Never know where to look, but it's coming towards me. So thank both of you for being here to answer some of our questions on this important issue. And I guess for me, having listened to everybody so far, the main question that comes to mind is, given we just finished a study on retention and recruitment, if we create a separate body completely from the CAF, and it's specifically meant for natural disasters and for coming to the aid of Canadians when such a disaster occurs, is that not the same or similar type of profile to someone who would apply for the CAF? And considering the fact that right now the competition level is quite high between the general jobs on the market and the CAF, and that's the main reason why they can't find enough personnel, is this not going to make it even more difficult? What are some of the factors that could differentiate the two, and that would make it so that they don't poach from each other?
So, again, that's a great question, and given the ongoing recruitment issues that the CAF is experiencing, I do see that. I would argue, though, that if you look at what's going on in emergency management in the country right now, it is an increasingly diverse group of people that are going through these professional education programs that Mr. Bowen talked about when he was in front of your committee, and that are in schools across this country. And I think if you look at the makeup of emergency managers, we are seeing a transition into a much more diverse work body. I think historically, right, emergency managers were often retired CAF or Coast Guard or police, and certainly they're still there and they still do great work. But we also see a lot of other people moving into this field in Canada and abroad. So I think that a civilian response force would appeal to a broader base of individuals that are interested in joining the CAF. And I think, motivations might be different. The experience would certainly be different. So I think, there would be a body of recruits, right, the CAF can't draw upon. Now, all that said, I'm not saying might not be struggles with this given the competitive job market that exists. It'll be interesting to see in that light how British Columbia does, because it's recently decided to expand its civilian wildfire fighting force to 1,000 permanent full-time year-round employees who will be doing disaster prevention, mitigation, preparedness work. And so it'd be interesting to see how that model comes through, and if they do struggle with recruitment. I think that's something to keep an eye on for sure.
What I would add to that is, I think if we recognize that the fight against climate change is in many ways fundamentally different than the fight against foreign adversaries, that we might actually expect there to be different pools of prospective applicants for these two different types of roles. The Canadian Armed Forces on one side as a warfighting entity, and then some kind of resilience corps on the other. When we think about the communities that have been affected by major climate disasters, it's all manner of people from all manner of walks of life who will have seen their own lives, their own homes, their own families be implicated in those kinds of disasters. And I think for a range of reasons relating to, on the one hand, flexibility around accommodating other work or students and so forth, people who might see joining the forces in one capacity or another as not being compatible with their other priorities, their other kind of life goals, but joining some kind of locally based entity that will be able to continue to maintain the integrity of their community in the face of climate change might be quite a bit more appealing. And if I may, I would just also note that I think the current conflict in Eastern Europe, the invasion of Ukraine, is a clarifying moment in terms of the function of the Canadian Armed Forces as a warfighting and ultimately, kind of alliance-oriented military. And so while that is separate to our discussion here, I do think that many people in Canada may well look at the CAF with a kind of renewed sense of its core military functions in light of the current conflict.
Thank you. I appreciate both of your answers. They were very good. I guess my next question would be to Mr. Kickert. You mentioned the study in Australia, the fact that they have a volunteer program right now, and that the main issue with theirs is that the traditional role of the traditional volunteer, the traditional model of volunteer has changed, that it's older people that are looking to volunteer now, and they're not necessarily the same type of volunteers. What solutions have they turned to? What have they discovered, or what are they going to be doing instead in the future?
Briefly, please.
That's a great question, and there's certainly a lot of elements to it. They have shown, right, that their state emergency services are in some states struggling to find enough volunteers. And so some of the solutions they are talking about, again, this is an ongoing conversation right now. Things like providing, additional incentives to volunteers, and tax breaks, this kind of thing, or transitioning to a paid on-call kind of thing, where these people are paid for the training they undertake during their weekends or their nights, and they're paid when they are on call. They have officially now implemented a program where if you are like a volunteer firefighter or a member of the SES, State Emergency Service, if you deploy over a long term for a disaster, you will be compensated for that now, something like $300 a day to a maximum of $6,000. So they are experimenting with different structures, but certainly this is an ongoing concern, and that conversation is just getting started about how to encourage.
We're going to have to leave it there,
volunteerism.
unfortunately. Madame Normandine,
2.5 minutes, please. It's been mentioned. One of the strengths of the regular armed forces is that they have a very good rational operational force, and the Rangers know the land well. But when you talk about the possibility of creating something that would also add safety of the civilian populace into the mix, would it not be simpler to better fund the reserve to create more permanent positions?
Again, I think, a conversation about the reserve's future and what that looks like and the role that they might play in disaster response, I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have. I would again argue, though, that the recruitment base for a civilian response agency would be broader than for the Army Reserves. And again, I am not an expert on the military reserves. I do work with the Rangers a lot. And I know that they are great resources for their communities, but I also am not sure the CAF wants to have Ranger patrols in every single community in the country, right? So I think there's definitely questions about, how far to push this model. And there are questions about the reserves and what they can do in this role. And it's a conversation worth having, and I think that's all I can say about it.
And I'll defer to my colleagues' comments in response. Thank you.
In the same vein, if we were ever to decide to go more towards the reserve, could there be a sharing of responsibility between the federal government and the provinces so that each time there's a need, the provincial government wouldn't have to beg the federal government? So would that be an option to allow the provincial government to intervene?
What I would simply add to that is that there's no restriction currently on the capacity of the provinces to establish their own response capabilities of whatever sort. So I think provinces exercise the sufficient jurisdiction should they see the need to create their own autonomous capabilities. And the government of Canada is quite, I think, distinct from that. Whether or not that's advisable, whether or not that's the most kind of financially or fiscally responsible route or the most effective in case of actual disasters, I think is precisely the conversation that would need to be based on evidence and study and informed opinion.
Normandine, colleagues, I see that our next folks have arrived, and I don't want to hold them up. My thought is this, that we give Ms. Matson a minute and 2 minutes to Ms. O'Connell and Mr. Motz, and call it a day. Is that acceptable? One question, 1 minute. Madame Matson.
Can you hear me, first of all? Okay, great. I'll get it one day. It was just a return to my other question, and if you could answer that within a minute, I would appreciate that in terms of that environmental proactiveness and reactiveness situation.
So I think, just in terms of what the CAF does, I'll just highlight again, it's not doing the mitigation, the prevention, the preparedness, the recovery work. And I think that's a severe limitation to our current setup, right? Our disaster workforce is kind of solely focused on that one part of the continuum. And again, I do not see the Canadian Armed Forces playing roles in those other parts of this spectrum. And I think that's a major challenge that needs to be filled by other capacities and other capabilities. But I'm not sure that's actually getting to what you're asking. So Sorry.
But
And if I might, if I understand your question correctly, ma'am, the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defense have a huge role to play in terms of emissions reduction, understood as climate mitigation. The majority of the Government of Canada's real estate portfolio is owned by DND. DND runs an air fleet. I mean, these are hugely carbon intensive activities. And so there is a very significant scope for greening the activities of the Canadian Armed Forces in all manner of ways. But I think a really perhaps underappreciated part of that is responsible stewardship of the land, which is controlled and maintained by national defense.
I'm trying to prevent Ms. Masson turning her 1 minute into 2.5. It's exceeding, I can see that. Mr. Motz, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I guess a 30-second question and a 25-minute answer, I'm sure, but in terms of the principles of emergency management, how do you see a separate civilian agency being used in response, recovery, preparedness, and mitigation of natural disaster emergencies, as opposed to CAF being used, or even with the use of reserves, the reserves concept as we talked about? And I'll start with Professor Kirkett first.
So again, I think a civilian emergency response force that could be, again, a mixture of full-time employees and part-time employees who can be mobilized during these disasters. They have the benefit of being able to rapidly deploy if they're part of this force. But more importantly, again, they can focus, especially the full-time employees, right? They can be used for other tasks, during periods of the year when there are not so many hazards being posed to communities, and when they can be used for things like prevention mitigation, whether it be forestry management or constructing dikes or whatever it might be. There's a wide variety of roles they can play that the CAF and the reserves can't because of their training focused on their warfighting role. So that's where I see the value of a civilian emergency force and it being able to slide in and cover the rest of that emergency management spectrum. With the support of local teams, of course.
Mr. Reeves? Professor
Thank
Reeves?
you. I was just going to say that final point as well, which is I think that such a national resilience corps would probably work best when it was well supported by locally based community entities of some sort or another. And that would open up this question about whether or not local authorities, municipal or provincial, or potentially regional as well, would be able to call upon those lower levels, however they were structured, before invoking the national level of response. That we might actually be able to locate the authority to invoke this, this capability in the communities that are immediately affected before then calling in the feds.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. Final 2 minutes, Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll just ask the question that we left off on in my 2 minutes. If the ideal is to have local authorities train up and kind of own that training and own that initial response, but the way the system is now, I mean, you look back historically, famously, when there's too much snow in Toronto, the military is called in. So how do we actually, as a federal government, position the local authorities to actually build up this capability so that CAF really is brought in for whether it's an organizational assistance or specific assistance that they can offer as kind of that last resort? How do we get to that place, or how do we incentivize that sort of establishment? Can be to either of you.
Sure. I think so. Again, very quickly, I think a good climate change response for this country would be to ensure that every municipality has an emergency manager, right? In Nova Scotia, I think 8 of 40 municipalities have full-time emergency manager positions in their and I think that's too few. So I think ensuring that municipalities have emergency managers who are well trained, who have standardized skills and professional abilities that they've been taught. I think that can be the building stone, and then you have the local response teams who the emergency manager can assist in training and preparing, who have national standardized competencies and who maybe can be used regionally as well, not just focus on the local community. That's one step. But again, I do think given the hazard, given the disaster, you are going to require that next level, which is that federal response or the provincial response as well, right? That needs to be there as well and can deploy quickly to these scenes. So I'm not sure you're ever going to be able to get out of having to have that other level of response outside the local, but there are certainly ways that we can strengthen that local side of things moving forward, and relatively inexpensively, I would argue, with emergency managers and these local teams.
Unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. I want to thank Ms. O'Connell for her final question. And on behalf of the committee, thank both of you, Professor Greaves and Professor Kickert, for your contribution to our study. We seem to have uniformly excellent presentations, and you two certainly have lived up to that standard. So with that, colleagues, I'm going to adjourn this meeting. We will have to re-empanel. Those who are online will need to sign off and then sign in again. So with that, and I'm hoping we can do it quickly. So with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.